You're listening to Leading Up with Udemy. This podcast is your guide to developing your skills as an emerging or seasoned leader. I'm Alan Todd, your host and the Vice President of Leadership Development at Udemy. Together, we can work, lead, and live differently to create a better world. I was excited to have Deb Tees on the podcast today. My aha moment was when Deb talked about taking lateral moves, the need to build your skills broad before you can go deep. So going to different places, working in different departments to broaden your skills before you go deep in one department.
The more you do, the more you learn what you don't know. I think that's the key. People think the higher I go and the more I move, the more I'll know. I think it's the reverse. I think it's the more you realize what you don't know, the more you expose yourself to things that might be lateral, the more you realize that that is bringing value to you as a person, to you as a professional, and to the organization that you serve.
This week, I'm speaking with Deb Tees, who leads talent and organizational capability at Lockheed Martin, a $67 billion aerospace and defense company with over 100,000 employees. Deb and I go way back, having spent many years together as doctoral students at the University of Pennsylvania. She's had a fascinating career journey from entry-level worker to senior business leader and holds degrees in psychology and counseling, as well as a doctorate from Penn's Chief Learning Officer program. I'm thrilled to have her here today. Deb, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Alan. I'm honored to be here today.
All right. So let's start off with your own career path and see if we can tease some lessons out of that. So describe the journey that got you to where you are today.
Yeah, happy to do that, Alan. You know, I was thinking about this ahead of time and how would I describe my career and what would be interesting to know. And I thought about my career as some of the listeners may be too young to remember this, but do you remember the magic eye puzzles where you had to step back and look at them to find a 3D picture? It was a bunch of colors and dots, and you couldn't always see a pattern in the puzzles. But if you step back and you kind of blur your eyes and you look at it for a while, eventually a 3D picture would emerge. And so as I think about a career journey and my career journey in particular, that's really what I liken it to. So over time, you may not always see the series of steps and where it's going to take you, but eventually as you start to step back, the picture emerges and the mosaic becomes something beautiful. And you start to say, this is where I contribute the most, uniquely me, what I can do. This is where I want to go next. This is where I can add value. And this is really how this is shaping up to be me in terms of my career journey. And so that's what I believe has happened to me over time, because I didn't start out with knowing exactly what I wanted to do, right? I just took a first step and then it emerged from there.
Talk about that first step, because I wanted to hear, how did you choose your major in college? Because I think a lot of people, it doesn't connect with their career. So where did you start? How did that evolve?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my philosophy on this is that a college major doesn't necessarily determine the course of your career. It's early. And so you might have a series of interests that lead you down a path, or you might be forced to just pick something so that you can graduate. And it's early to really know where your passions lie, where you can add value, and what you want to spend your days doing ultimately. So I did have a sense that I wanted to focus somewhere around maximizing human potential, right? So psychology was always fascinating to me, the science of human behavior, human thought, motivations. And so I followed that path and I got my degree in psychology. And then when I graduated, I thought I wanted to follow that path. And so I went to graduate school around being a counselor, and counselor education and marriage and family therapy is where I ultimately landed. I thought I had a passion around doing that work and helping people maximize their potential. And what I discovered is while I enjoyed that work, that platform wasn't quite the one for me. And I actually took a course in the MBA program at Indiana University, and it was in organizational behavior. And all of a sudden, I put these pieces together and saw the translation of the systems dynamic in the family to the systems dynamic in terms of a corporation. And that felt right to me. That felt like a fit to me. And so I changed course, and that's when I really started working inside typical kinds of organizations and really looking at how I could apply those philosophies, those thought processes, those dynamics within a corporation.
Yeah, got it. So I wanted to just get your thoughts on, so I think people think they need to get promoted to the next level, and that's the way you make it to the top, right? And you took lateral moves and thought about it differently. So why did you take on new roles that weren't promotions or across departments or even changing industries. How did you make sense of all that?
Yeah, I do think that people think oftentimes upward trajectory is the only way to go. And part of why I think that's true is because when people share their career stories, they share that linear view of their career. I was here and then I moved up to here and then I moved up to there. The reality is what you don't see is all of the color in the background that tells you what roles they didn't get, what roles they didn't take, and choices they made along the way, right? So if we were to paint a picture of what people didn't do, it would tell you a lot more about their career than what they actually did. And so there were jobs that I didn't get. There are jobs that I didn't take because of where I was in my life or it didn't fit for whatever reason. Yeah. And so I think that's really important to acknowledge in the career journey. That is just as important, being very intentional about what you do. And when you don't take something, that's okay. That just shapes your future. And so for me, as I looked at opportunities, it was less about moving up, although that was certainly an aspiration of mine. But it was, how do I build my perspective? How do I contribute more? How do I understand the world better? Because the more perspectives you have to weave together, the more impact you can make. And it's like these series of aha moments, just understanding where other people are coming from, what you need to know in order to be more impactful with people and speak from their point of view, understand what they're thinking, what their filters are, what their motivations are. And so it just broadens your ability to make that kind of impact.
And how do you decide? Because it seems to me like when people are considering their career, how do you decide when you take a lateral move or not? It feels like that's not an easy decision to make.
It's not. I think part of it depends on the organization, right? Because if it's a small organization and you, in the course of a role that you're in, you have enough breadth to feel like you really understand the dynamics across the scope of what you're doing, of your industry, of your organization, then I think moving up is often a good option because you are then broadening and trying your hand at something new. But in a large organization or a large industry with a lot of facets, I think it's a self-reflection to say, how much do I want to try and just move up, or how much do I want to broaden so that I can bring the best perspective to this organization? And how much do I want to learn and feel equipped to take on other perspectives? To be honest with you, I'm not sure that I knew that until I took a first kind of lateral move, right? The more you do, the more you learn what you don't know. I think that's the key. People think the higher I go and the more I move, the more I'll know. I think it's the reverse. I think it's the more you realize what you don't know. You can go an inch deep and a mile wide on a lot of things. And so, even when I have casual conversations with people, I went and toured a lot of organizations when I was leading the Growth 100 program at Indiana University. I talked to CEOs at over 50 different companies that were high growth, high potential companies. They were really trying to grow their idea into something big. And I would take tours of their factories and things. And I remember going to one of them that was a chip factory. And I got to see how they infused the air into the bags. And just things that you never even think about, right? And so you just, as soon as you ask a question, you realize that there are people who have spent their whole lives understanding the depths and dynamics of topics that you never even knew existed. And so the more I learn that, the more I just need to be curious. The more I need to understand about what people are thinking and what you need to consider and points of view that you want to infuse into the way that you approach the work that you do. And so I think the more you expose yourself to things that might be lateral, things that might be outside of your swim lane or what you ever thought you would do, the more you realize that that is bringing value to you as a person, to you as a professional, and to the organization that you serve.
Yeah. So your advice is don't always chase the money.
Yes. Well, it's a confluence of factors, right? And that's the other thing, is that I think people believe there is a right path to take. There's a picture that Mary Engelbreit painted years ago, which there's a person walking down and there's a fork in the road and the person is pursuing one of the forks and it says your life and the other fork says no longer an option, right? Because you make a choice, and that is the choice for now. And you have to weigh a lot of factors. You have to weigh the money, the location, the type of work, the level of the job, the people that you're working with, and your life circumstances. You have moments in your life where it's not the right time to take a bigger job or to take a job that requires a lot of travel. Then to recognize that any choice you make is a good one, as long as you look at what you can take from it, what you can learn, and to know that you have options. You're never locked in, right? So even if you don't like what you're doing, you can still learn from what you're doing, take the lessons and apply it to the next thing and start pursuing and finding an option that you never even knew existed. So I do think it's really important to not put yourself in a position to think there is one right path and to not chase the level and chase the money. That can be an aspiration, and equip yourself to do it well. Because if you don't equip yourself well enough, when you get there, it either may not be fulfilling or you may not perform at the level you had hoped you would.
So are you naturally curious, or is this a habit that you developed over time?
It's a great question. I think it's a little bit of both. The more I have learned about what I don't know, the more I believe I need to ask questions. And I also have learned that for me personally, if someone asks me a question, I want to give them an answer. I want to be the expert. I want to know. I don't want to show up as not having the information. And what I've learned is that is really not the most effective strategy to answer someone's question. The best strategy to answer someone's question is to ask them a question. Because until you understand their motivation and why they are asking you, you cannot adequately answer their question. And so the curiosity about, well, what is it you're really seeking? Or what makes you ask that question? Or what would you think about this? Or what's your experience been? That next question unlocks a whole different direction and opens a conversation that you wouldn't have otherwise had. You get to learn about that person and their perspective. You get to learn about what they're working on and what they're doing. And it informs the way you shape a response to that question. So I have developed a filter, if you will. When someone asks me a question, I really, truly, in the moment, try and stop myself from answering so that I can be curious, so that I can ask a question, so that I can understand. And it's quite frankly, a really good way to network and to have dialogues is thinking about, how do I get curious? So if you go to a networking event or you go to any kind of event with other people, if they tell you something, the next thing you do instead of reciprocating is asking them a question about it. You're always going to discover there is something that you don't know, something that they want to share. People love to share about themselves, right? So it's always a success story to ask a question, to get curious. And I've walked away learning so many interesting things from so many different people just by asking that next question.
Yeah, I love it. So that whole sort of set of thinking about asking that next question, I think is a really powerful concept for developing curiosity. So can you talk about what are some of your habits around lifelong learning? Is it reading, thinking, questioning? You just gave us a whole thing there, but things that you do to stay up to date.
So there are a couple things I do. One is following the thread on what we just talked about is self-reflection. So anytime there's a circumstance, especially the ones that I struggle with, when there was an interaction I didn't like or something didn't go well at work or didn't go as well as I would have liked, right? I always stop and think, what was my role in that? What led to that? How could I do it differently next time? My focus is always on not beating myself up about something, but how do I get better next time? It's continuous improvement. And so that reflection of, it's this. Okay, next time, here's what I'm going to go do. And so I'm always pushing myself to be better in the future because there's going to be another opportunity to do something like that again or to take that lesson and apply it to something else. So I'm always pushing, always reflecting, even when it's hard, because that's when I learn the most. And then in terms of what I do and what I read, I get a lot of emails from newsletters and vendors, and I don't read all of them, right? But It's really important to have a pulse of what the conversations are and what's going on, especially when it's a little bit out of my swim lane. So being fluent in the language of what is happening around us is really important. And so I find myself often able to bring new ideas and application of things that we may not yet be thinking about in terms of the company because I'm listening to these external influences. And that is really, I found to be very effective in applying back to the work that I do and just growing my mindset in general and opening it up for new ideas.
Yeah, so I'm curious how you do it at work. So as a talent leader, how do you develop people to become lifelong learners, to develop curiosity? Because I'm sure you have to build every kind of skill under the sun at Lockheed Martin. So how do you think about that and pulling people along?
So I would say there are a lot of ways that we help people become lifelong learners and to develop them at the companies you mentioned, various types of development opportunities. I think one of the most powerful things we have done in my time at Lockheed Martin is work on the culture, right? So when we brought Sikorsky in about 7 years ago, we embarked on a culture journey to try and integrate the corporations because we knew that was a huge piece of our ability to be successful and to deliver back value to the street. And so the most important part of the work that we did on culture was not actions and results, but was really thinking about what do people need to believe in order for us to be successful and take these kinds of actions? And what experiences are they having that are creating those beliefs or shifting those beliefs? Because that's the part underneath the surface that is so powerful in driving anyone's behavior. It's what are they experiencing and what beliefs does that set of experiences lead to? And the reason I bring this up is because when you talk about asking questions or being curious, when you start to talk about what's in someone's head, what do they believe, you might say, well, let's be the best in the business on X dimension, right? But if the person's like, yeah, we've said that before, we've tried it before, and it doesn't work because nobody ever listens around here, right? Let's just take that for an example. If they believe nobody ever listens around here, they're not going to engage in this new thing to create the best in class organization around that dimension. And then you start to unpack and you say, well, what makes you think that nobody listens? Well, when I give my ideas, I get shut down. Or if you give an idea that's counter to the leader who's presenting it, everyone just dismisses it and it doesn't matter anyway, or they say something derogative. And so you start to understand what's the series of things that has led to this ingrained belief. And in order to shift that, you've got to design a different experience and say, okay, well, next time when people are talking, how do we respond differently in order to really absorb that input and think about it and value it and make decisions that are based on a collective body of input so that we can then make a different decision. And all of a sudden, people feel heard and listened to. But that has to happen with intention. And the only way we get to that is by asking questions, having dialogue, being curious, understanding what has gotten to someone to where they are today. And by the way, if this is what I want you to believe, this new thing, what would it take to get there? What would you need to see? What does success look like on that dimension? And so when you start to have those conversations, you have to get curious. You have to ask questions. You have to learn. And by the way, then you have to be willing to shift and then check in and see how that's going. So I think this constant intentionality around how we work and how we show up, because that happens for leaders, that happens for individuals, it doesn't matter. But I think the culture work, the kind of conversations you encourage, the dialogues, the learning from, the willingness to shift, the vulnerability, all of those things are really critical to engender that kind of mindset around learning more so than any course could ever be.
One of the things I wanted to talk about was leadership communications. It comes up as a huge thing. We do at Udemy, study billions of searches, have, 70 million learners on the platform. So they're doing searches all the time. Leadership communication comes up all the time. I know you had a really interesting story about just having to change the word or the phrase and developing a sense of how you come across or how others perceive you. So I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah. So one of the biggest lessons that I learned as a leader, or even as an individual, is to meet people where they are and understand that, because it really changes the dynamics of everything. So when I was working at a former company, we were rebranding. And so everything was shifting. And we had to find a way to really make sure that the entire population of the company understood the new brand, was able to adopt it and implement things related to that. And so I was relatively new in role. This was a big project for me. So I went in armed with, we need to do change management and we have change campaigns and we're going to put these people on and here's how it's going to work. And this was with the executives of the organization and they hated it. They absolutely were like, just completely didn't want to hear it, didn't want to listen.
Were you devastated? Did that knock you down? Or did you learn and grow from it? Like what happened in the immediate term and then in the long term? Because I'm guessing you learned.
Yeah, of course. In the immediate term, I was devastated. I was like, what just happened here? I used all my resources. I brought in these ideas that work at these big corporations. And it was probably one of my first opportunities to stand in front of executives and really propose something big. And it did not go well. And so I absolutely felt defeated. But as I mentioned to you before, I'm fairly resilient, right? Because my first response is obviously the emotional one. But the second response is, how do I get back control of the situation and how do I make it better? And so I just reflected on, well, why did they have that kind of reaction? What was driving that? And sometimes it's the filter that people are looking through. It's whatever association they might have with a particular term or approach or something you might propose. And so I talked about the fact that we need people to be ready for the change. So how do we make sure people are ready to absorb this and move forward? And I really streamlined the conversation and said, if we just focus on making sure people are ready for this. And so I started using the term readiness for change, readiness for adoption, and doing a readiness assessment to see where we are and what we might need to do to prepare for the future. And they loved it. They were 100% on board. And we ran with the readiness assessment and looked at what we needed to do. And if you think about it, objectively speaking, change management versus readiness, it's not fundamentally different, but for them it was. And changing the words and changing the approach unlocked something different for them and allowed them to drop the barrier that was there for them under change management and open themselves to readiness. And we were able to accomplish it. So it's important to be flexible and to really think about your audience, think about what they might be thinking, and as much as possible in advance to get that kind of intel. But you don't always know. You're going to trip over things because people don't always tell you what obstacle you might run into. So have the reaction. It's a natural thing, but bounce back fast and say, okay, let me learn from that. Help me understand, or talk to other people and reflect and come back with something different. Soften, be willing to shift your approach and meet people where they are, because ultimately you're going to be able to achieve something great. You just might have to take a different path.
Yeah, I really love the lesson from that. That's a completely different lesson, is that great leaders have relentless perseverance. They always pick themselves back up and dust themselves off, learn from whatever the setback was, and go right back at it again. And your example there reminds me of that. I want to get back to business for a second. Hybrid working at Lockheed Martin. So I know that you have always been a global company. You've got people all over the world in every time zone. But right now, since the pandemic, there's just been a lot of research. People are really struggling with hybrid work, and the employees don't seem to have the same desires as the CEOs and vice versa. And I'd love to hear, what is your perspective on leading a hybrid workplace or hybrid work, and rooted in, did the pandemic change everything or did it change nothing? And where are you today on that? And have you got it figured out or not?
Absolutely. So obviously the pandemic was an inflection point for people, right? So before the pandemic at Lockheed Martin, we had some parts of our business that were fairly distributed in nature geographically, right? And so therefore there was a little bit more of a comfort level with a distributed work environment, and then those that were primarily in 1 or 2 or 3 locations. I would say, though, that the instance of true telework was pretty low. With the pandemic, we obviously had to flip the switch, and we had many, many people working in other locations, and we had to rapidly adapt technology to create connections for people, to have ways to work together effectively. And a lot of the video technology like Zoom came into play. And we discovered something about ourselves, that we had the ability to connect and to work and to be effective, even when we weren't sitting in the same location. Now, we also felt the absence of the presence of each other, right? And things that work really well in person. And not everybody was working from different locations. Some people had to be in their location. You can't build a helicopter from your home, right? There's classified work where you have to be in a certain environment. And there are a lot of things where there may be some more flexibility. And we learned that over the course of the pandemic. So now we're in this place where people are feeling the tug for a number of different reasons, between having people together or on site at a particular location and allowing the flexibility for people to be in multiple locations. And so at Lockheed, what we did was really step back and say, this really isn't about whether I work from home or I sit in an office. This is really about being effective in a distributed work environment, because the reality is we have work all over the globe. Even if everyone came into their local office every single day, we'd never still all be together. And by the way, there are time zone differences, and we work for different business areas and business units and organizations, and we need to come together as one company, and we need to work across all these dimensions and be effective. So at the end of the day, the underlying premise of where we are is be there when it matters. And sometimes it really matters. And sometimes it really doesn't. You could do the same thing regardless of where you're sitting, whether you're sitting in the office or you're sitting at home. If I've got Zoom calls all day with people who are not near me, there's no reason that I just sit in an office and do that versus sit in a home office and do that, right? So it's be there when it matters. And then the other piece is productive everywhere. So whether you are sitting in an office or at a customer site in a classified environment on the production line, it's productive everywhere. And how do we do that effectively? So we came up with this model that has 4 guideposts around how to be productive everywhere. And so the first one is around intentional connection and collaboration, right? So that's that be there when it matters piece. There are times when being together is really impactful and really important in driving some kind of outcome. So we're not dismissing that. It's just choosing when that is versus arbitrarily from the top of the house saying everyone needs to be in a certain location a certain number of times a week, because the leaders at the top of the organization don't see and know the dynamics of what's happening on a team who's closest to the work. The team closest to the work can determine when is it mattering. And so we backed into this model, by the way, by working with leaders who had leaned in and were doing this well. And we found the same 4 things that every leader who was doing this well was doing. And that first one was around intentional collaboration and connection. The second guidepost is around leaders engaging with their teams to create team working agreements. So that focuses on getting input from all of your team members and creating clear guidance on how the team works together across all modalities with flexibility to modify, because we know circumstances change over time. So what that establishes is a clear shared understanding of priorities, of urgency, response times, and what the impact is of responding that way, so they can really be aligned on expectations and commitments. And then the third guidepost is around agile working practices. So that's adopting technologies and applications that help you be more transparent, more productive, more collaborative, and effective across all those dimensions. So things like Jira or Confluence or Microsoft Teams that open up the avenues for that kind of collaboration, regardless of where you're sitting and how you're working. And then the fourth guidepost is getting input and feedback from team members on a continual basis so you can respond and adjust. And that's one that seems like, why did you include that in the model? It's sort of second nature. It seems intuitive, but what we've found is people have a tendency to just set it and forget it, right? So the problem with that is, as I mentioned, things change over time. And so it's really important to check in and understand whether the things that were true when you set up the team working agreement initially are still true today, and whether you need to make some adjustments along the way.
How did your senior team come to accept this?
Yeah, you know what, Alan? It's a journey.
Yeah.
So we're just right now rolling this out very broadly. We rolled it out in one part of the organization, and now it's rolling out everywhere. So what I would say to you is what drives those in-person mandates is a lot of it is habit. This is the lever I have. If I feel like we may not be performing somewhere, I'm going to bring everybody in. But if you look at the data, it will show you that programs are struggling who are always on site. Programs are not struggling who are always off site, right? So you have a mix of both in both categories, but it's this knee-jerk reaction that people have, and it's the one lever they know how to pull, and they believe that it will solve problems. Now, in some cases, there are elements of it that will, and so you start to say, okay, well, here's what I believe will happen if we're on site. I believe if we have an issue, I can go right to this person and get a resolution immediately versus having to wait a day or two for a response time. Well, that tells me it's not necessarily about being on site in all cases. It's about getting a quick response. It's a service level, right? So if the expectation is you are available to me whenever we are in working hours so that you can respond quickly, and if it's something you need to be on site for, maybe it's you have to be available to drop everything and be on site within 30 minutes so that we can get a resolution within the hour. That's a level of flexibility, but you're still getting what you need versus I just need to tell everyone to be on site. So really unpacking that is important, but it is trust. And it's a level of capability at the leader level that not all leaders have yet.
Yeah.
Right. So that's part of the intention of this with this, the 4 guideposts and providing tools and resources and helping people understand how to define that and how to work with their teams, which, by the way, those conversations around team working agreements, it creates a level set of expectations for the team, which is just good leadership, right?
Sure.
It's good team practice. But it creates clarity around what we will do and how it will work. And it invites people into the conversation so they own part of it. And they know where this is going, and it evolves over time. And so that kind of flexibility, that kind of conversation builds trust within each individual team. And you're right, the senior leaders need to trust that their leaders are capable of doing this and will make the right decisions. So they're probably going to start with a little trust but verify.
Yeah.
And in some cases, they're not ready. But in some cases where they've opened that up, they've seen tremendous results. So it is an evolution. It is a journey. I won't tell you that everyone is doing this beautifully because we're really still a bit at the beginning of this journey. And the leaders who are doing it well had already leaned in to do it well. And now we're trying to equip everyone with all of the skills and the tools to universally do this well.
Beautiful. All right, Deb, as we wrap up here, we have a question that I ask everybody that comes on this podcast, and that is, what are you curious about and learning now? Could be personally or professionally.
Okay. Well, then I will give you two things. Personally, my son is trying out for a whole bunch of travel soccer teams. And the world of travel soccer, the number of types of leagues, the divisions of the leagues, where you play, the coaches, what you're aiming for, there is so much to know. It's another one of those things. You scratch the surface and you realize how much you do not know. But professionally, I will say leaning into new approaches like AI and GenAI, and that is a big place of exploration for us. We have tremendous opportunity, I believe, to augment the work that we are doing and thinking about how do we use this in a way that is incredibly productive and effective so that we can spend our time doing things that are the most meaningful, that only humans can contribute, the value that we really have to give, and not spend time on things that really don't require our brain power, don't require us to invest all of that, in some cases, wasted time, where we could really use our brilliance for something even more powerful to add value. I think there's a lot there. And so I am spending a lot of time thinking about how that plays out in the organization.
Deb Tees, my good friend, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you, Alan. An honor and a pleasure to be here today.
Thanks again to Deb Tees for joining us on the podcast. Follow Leading Up, a podcast from Udemy Business, wherever you find your podcast. We'll be back next Wednesday with another episode to help you level up your leadership skills. Follow the show so you never miss a new episode. And if you like the show, leave a rating or a review. We love the feedback, and it really helps us to find new listeners. To learn more about Leading Up or how Udemy can help you develop leaders at scale and move business forward, visit business.udemy.com. The Leading Up podcast is produced in partnership with Pod People. Our original theme is by Soundboard.